Right. Thank you all so much for joining us on this beautiful August day. Especially, I know that everyone's very busy prepping for Safe Routes fall activities. Today, we're going to be talking about liability in first aid in Safe Routes to School. My name is Emily Dugan. I am a member of the technical assistance provider team with ODOT Safe Routes to School. And today we are joined by Kori Johnson, who is a member of the National Safe Routes Partnership. So thank you so much for joining us, Kori. I really appreciate that. And Jessie Wilson, who is the Safe Routes coordinator for LaGrande. Here's just a quick agenda of what we're doing, what we're going to be talking about today. First, Kori is going to kick us off with a discussion about what liability means for Safe Routes. A little bit different format today to respect our speakers' times. We're going to have Q&A after they speak. So after Kori is done, you'll have a chance to ask questions about liability, any of your burning questions. Then we'll move into a discussion about first aid in the fields. And just after that, you'll have some time to do some quick Q&A. And then we'll go into some breakout room scenarios where you'll be given a scenario of some kind of possible injury that a student might get while you're doing your Safe Routes programming, and you'll come up with a way to address that. All right, and with that, I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen for a second and switch what I'm doing. Here we go. And then this is always how do I? You can tell I don't use PowerPoint very often. There we go. Awesome. All right, Kori, I'll let you kick it off.
Thanks, Emily. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I just got like a weird notice on my computer, like something's wrong with your audio, but it was just working. So I'll just ignore it and hope that it's hope that it's fine. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me for your call today. I'm Kori Johnson, the Safe Routes Partnership. I see a lot of familiar names on here, so nice to see those of you who I know, and nice to see people who I may be connecting with for the first time. So I'm here today to talk about Safe Routes to School and liability, which is a question that actually comes up a lot in the Safe Routes to School world. And so we kind of have this presentation that we do to kind of go over the basics of what you need to know about Safe Routes to School and liability, especially when it comes to working with schools and school districts. There's always a lot of questions and concerns about liability, so we want to give you some basic information that hopefully you can use in your program. Next slide, please. And just a quick disclaimer from the partnership, we're obviously not a legal organization. I'm not a lawyer. So, I definitely say that when it comes to discussing liability and like the ins and outs of it, that, like consulting an attorney or a law professional would probably be best. So we're just sharing some things that we know from our experience and from our research. But I would definitely recommend, connecting with people in your local area if you want, the most updated and accurate legal information when it comes to liability. Next slide. So just a bit about why we talk about liability, why this is an important issue. Like I said, it's something that comes up a lot. A lot of Safe Routes coordinators get questions about liability from schools, from districts, from parents, caregivers, adults. And, I think that we think about liability, our ultimate goal is to make sure that kids are happy, healthy, safe, and, and thriving, and that we want to make sure that liability in that conversation doesn't derail us from our ultimate goal of having kids being able to walk and roll and bike to school, and bike to school safely. So I hope this can be a conversation that, you can actually use to help advance your goals and not have it be one more barrier to Safe Routes to School. So that's a bit about why we talk about liability. Next slide. And so we know that the main institutional barrier to Safe Routes to School, one of them is a fear of liability. So, this comes up a lot, especially recently with a lot of bike education conversations, e-bike conversations. We get a lot of questions about, I can't do an e-bike program at my school because, it's not safe and the school is afraid of liability. So, we know that that's definitely a big barrier that some people experience when it comes to running Safe Routes to School programs. And, we've kind of seen that in communities across the country. The next slide. And if you just keep clicking. Yeah, so when we talk about liability, the conversation actually kind of kinds of ends up shutting down. And like when that conversation stops, it can actually result in, situations or conditions being less safe, kids being less healthy, and actually having a greater risk for liability. And if you, okay, it did pop up. Yeah, so it's kind of like those knee-jerk reactions can lead to things like, like not allowing for, a bike train program or walking school bus program, or, not allowing for, infrastructure that can actually support safe walking and biking and rolling. So in return, it can actually make things less safe, which isn't what we want. And so we actually don't want to like shut down the liability conversation, but actually be able to, talk about this in a way that's productive, in a way that's really advancing our goals of keeping kids, safe and healthy as they're walking and biking and rolling to school. So we say, go ahead and talk about it. And so we know that Safe Routes to School actually does help with reducing injuries, managing risks, and that, by you understanding a bit more about liability, that can help the conversation keep going. So it doesn't just like stop at, oh, we're concerned about liability, but it can actually become something that's productive and in service of your larger goals. When you think about liability in Safe Routes to School, in a Safe Routes to School context, really thinking about negligence. And if you click again, negligence is basically, the key to thinking about negligence is, has a person behaved with reasonable care in the situation in question? And reasonable care is the most important part here. So like it really depends on the situation. For example, if you're walking with a group of students and you're crossing a busy street and you allow a child to just run out into the street, that's different than if you're, in a park or in a field and there's a child who, runs in front of you into an open field. So when you think about reasonable care, really thinking about, like the situation and the context here. So are you operating with reasonable care, or are you just being careless and not necessarily caring about the safety or well-being of the child who you're with? Next slide. So basically, there's no liability unless somebody did not act with reasonable care, or that carelessness caused an injury. So again, if you're thinking about what reasonable care would look like, if you're running a bike program, making sure that students have helmets and a safe place to to do your program, that students aren't, or kids aren't just you're not just like throwing kids out into a super busy street and saying good luck. So reasonable care, you kind of get a sense of what that might look like. And then, again, that carelessness could cause an injury. So, encouraging or telling a child to run into, the middle of traffic, obviously that's a bit of carelessness there that could lead to an injury. So the whole point about liability is really thinking about, was there reasonable care in the situation? And if there was not, then that's when you kind of get into the liability conversation. Next slide. So it's really important also to think about kind of like the defenses against liability. So one is just immunity. So there's no liability there, even if there was negligence. And this is really why it's really important, again, to kind of think about your local context. Governmental and sovereign immunity is definitely alive, and often protects schools from liability, even when they've been negligent. So when we think about liability in schools, there are all kinds of things that can happen on a school campus, in a school building, lots of liability concerns. A lot of schools are protected from some of those liability issues. Does that mean that you should, consider risk when you're thinking about your program? No, but just, keep in mind that there is might be some built-in protection from the school or school district. This also varies by state. So again, thinking about your state, your district, your local context, that immunity will vary, in different degrees, whether it's, your school, local agency, a health department. They'll know a bit more about, like what liability looks like locally for you. So definitely, check your local jurisdiction, check your local, attorneys or law offices, school districts and agencies, health departments. I assume have, legal staff who they're working with. So it's always good to just check what the rules are and what the laws are in your local area. Next slide. A few other defenses against liability. There's also immunity for nonprofits. And again, this varies by state. So those of you who might be, running Safe Routes to School programs as part of nonprofit work or working with nonprofit partners, that's something else to keep in mind. And there are also protections for volunteers. So if you're thinking about, your bike rodeo volunteers or walking school bus, leaders, there's Volunteer Protection Act, which is a federal law that applies to all states except for New Hampshire. So you all are in Oregon, so you should be fine with that. So again, if you get questions about, are volunteers able to, do X, Y, are there liability concerns around that? There is the Volunteer Protection Act. So something else to keep in mind when you're thinking about your program partners. And just a few approaches to liability. If you go to the next slide. So we always just say the first step is really just to relax. Liability can sound really big and really scary and overwhelming. But we actually find at the partnership, based on our experiences of working with lots of Safe Routes to School programs, that liability risks are usually really exaggerated. We haven't seen any, at least when this presentation was created actually a few years ago, we don't know of any known lawsuits based on injuries from a Safe Routes to School program. So like somebody saying Safe Routes to School caused X to happen. We have not seen that. They could exist. I don't know, but our organization has not seen any. And that, most injuries result in no claim or a frivolous claim that could be weeded out or just sensationalistic reporting, which does happen and does play a role in the liability conversation as well. So just keep that the messaging piece in mind too, especially if there are injuries, that do come up, which unfortunately happens around school campuses. Next slide. So the next step is really just to, be responsible. Like I mentioned earlier, liability is really about acting with or without reasonable care. So use reasonable care when you're setting up your programs, which I assume you all are doing. So things like, making sure that students have helmets or proper and adequate equipment, or that you're really thinking about the safest routes for a walking, school bus program. All of those things kind of lend to that reasonable care piece. You can also anticipate potential dangers and then, take reasonable steps to avoid them. So sometimes there's a walking school bus program that happens on, in a non-ideal, street. It might be busy or there's a lot of school construction going on. How do you kind of plan for, running programs in the midst of everything that could be happening, on a road? So, as you're thinking about your program planning, kind of anticipate what those potential dangers could be and then put together some next steps to avoid them. This is where, working with your community partners or Safe Routes to School district or task force could also help, kind of talking through some of these, concerns and coming up with a really solid plan for how to address them. And then also communicate about roles and responsibilities, so who's in charge of what? So if there's a walking school bus program, who's doing what? If there's a bike rodeo, who's doing what? Walk and roll to school day, who's doing what? Who's on what corner? How are you, collaborating with, the crossing guards and school staff and parents and caregivers and trusted adults, making sure that everybody has their really clearly defined roles and responsibilities. I think that makes everybody feel a lot more secure in what they're doing and more confident, and also shows you're really working together as a team. So that's step 2. And then next slide. It's also just having a backup plan, so things like, insurance. I talked about immunity earlier, indemnification, which is basically compensation for harm or legal security against liability. And again, these are probably things that are super in the weeds, so not necessarily something that you all would need to dive too deep into. This is where consulting with legal experts is a good idea, and talking with your districts about what's allowed and what's not allowed. But having a backup plan is good, and also just apologize, which isn't, it's not a legal strategy. When it comes to addressing liability in the same way that immunity might be. But, we know that we live in the real world and that things happen. There might be a student who falls off their bike, or who, has an injury as they're, walking or rolling to school. And it's not that you didn't act with reasonable care or put them in a harmful situation, but it's just that that's what happens in real life. And, sometimes you do need to apologize for something that happens. And, that's something that, that can go a long way, both in, kind of like building that trust, and also just acknowledging that, sometimes we have to take responsibility if there's something that goes wrong, under our watch. And so, and an apology is just another very practical strategy when it comes to dealing with situations that might happen as you're running your Safe Routes to School program. So just our final takeaways when it comes to liability. This could honestly be a whole, webinar series, full-fledged, presentation. But I wanted to kind of give you the short and abridged version of this presentation. But basically, be thoughtful about how you set up your programs and run your activities. And that really helps you avoid liability. So again, like that reasonable care part, just making sure that you are really thoughtful about where you're hosting, activities and who's there, and, defining roles and responsibilities, making sure that everybody kind of knows what they're doing. A thoughtful plan is always a great way to kind of address liability before something actually happens. Steps that you can take to make sure that your children are safe also protect you from liability. So, like I said, things like, having helmets, having defined spaces for different activities, having different partners who you can collaborate with, all of those steps and all of that planning really helps you avoid some of those liability risks. The status quo is often a bad option. So like I mentioned earlier, if we shut down conversations about liability, that means we're not actually helping, kids, be safer and healthier. So instead of shutting down the conversation, just allowing things to stay as they are, and not having as much walking or biking or rolling, try to open up that conversation, and at least see if there's some sort of compromise that can be made when it comes to what's possible for a Safe Routes to School program. And of course, balance the benefits versus the risks. So again, like I just mentioned, this is the real world. There are risks to lots of things. And when you think about the benefits of Safe Routes to School, of what it can do for students and a community, those benefits often outweigh the risks. So keep that in mind too. And that is about it for my very short presentation on liability. I'm happy to answer any questions. If you all have follow-up questions, you're welcome to reach out to me as well. Like I said, I know it's a pretty dense topic sometimes, but this is just some information that we found from a national lens when it comes to Safe Routes to School and liability.
And feel free to unmute yourself and if you have any questions. I'm kind of interested in why New Hampshire is the only state that doesn't have that Volunteer Protection Act, but
I actually don't know. I don't know where that came from. But yeah, apparently they're the outliers there. So I'm, not sure why, not sure why that is. And I guess another thing too is if you're working with volunteers, and like a school might know this too. I know that, schools have procedures in place for parent volunteers. So you can see how they kind of address the, like liability question, or, is that covered under doing a Safe Routes to School program that's connected to a school? So again, a lot of these are kind of really local and granular questions that might just need to be answered by people who are in your local context, but it's always good to ask.
any questions before?
I had a question. I work closely with two Safe Routes to School coordinators, and my organization is an economic development district. So I'm not really, if I'm part of a walking school bus or a bike train, I'm not really a volunteer. I don't belong to a nonprofit organization. We're a governmental organization. And I've always wondered what kind of liability MCAD might be subjected to in case, I don't know, in case I ran into a kid on a bike, or, like with my bike or something like that. And you didn't really address, you address volunteers and nonprofits, but in this case, I've always wondered what that special kind of liability might look like with partners that are not nonprofits. They're like the North Central Public Health District or the city of the Dalles, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I find that most, like the walking school bus programs that we work with a lot, I mean, some of them talk about liability, but some of them, are just kind of like, oh, you want to, be a walking school bus leader. That's fine. And like, actually don't even go into much detail as what you just went into. I'm not sure about like other partners outside of like nonprofit partners or school district partners. That might be something for, did you say you're part of an economic development
A
organization?
district.
Okay, economic development district. So that might be a question for the district, like if they have, certain liability, protections when it comes to the work that you all are doing in the, in the community. But honestly, we don't see a lot of, especially when it comes to like walking school bus programs or bike train programs. We don't see a lot of programs that really think that much about, liability issues when it comes to their walking school bus leaders or bike train leaders. It's not because it's not important. It's just that that's not something that they're, that they're focusing on. They're just like, we have this group of volunteers or leaders, and they're great. So I think in this situation, I would check with the environmental development district and see if they have some sort of, liability protection or guidance when it comes to working with communities. But yeah, that honestly hasn't really come up a whole lot in the work that we've seen. Megan, I see your question in the chat. Reasonable care could be subjective. Yes, right? What somebody thinks might be reasonable care, other people might think would be negligent or reckless. I actually don't know like the ins and outs of how that's navigated in terms of liability. It could just be like a case-by-case basis. Again, like a lawyer who's probably worked on some of these, issues before and probably be able to break it down a bit more. But it is subjective. And I really think that it would be, a case-by-case basis. And, like you said, a lot of what, I was mentioning seems like, second nature to safety, but might not be to others. I also think that it's helpful, like in your Safe Routes to School program to talk about and be really open about what it is that you're doing to keep kids safe while you're running a Safe Routes to School program. So, communicating, letting people know, that if we're doing a bike activity, we do have helmets or have helmets, that are available, or, we're teaching bike skills, we're teaching bike skills or leading a bike rodeo because we want to enhance safety. So kind of like keeping the conversation always on keeping kids safe, keeping kids active, and building healthy, thriving communities. Could be another way to kind of like get ahead of some of those issues. But you're totally right when it comes to reasonable care. That's a very open-ended, term and can mean lots of different things. And it probably just depends on, context and a case-by-case basis. We know that there are some things, especially with Safe Routes to School, since it's a, tried and true program and evidence-based program, we know that there are certain things that do keep kids safe. So wearing a helmet, that's definitely a safety best practice. Or even like a walking school bus program, being able to walk to school, walk and roll to school, with a trusted adult and with another group of young people, is one way to make that trip to school, safer. So yeah, that's my answer about reasonable care. But you're right, I don't have an answer for all the nuance that lies there because there's a lot.
Yeah, a lot of this feels very, very subjective. And I think most school districts do have a lawyer. So if you have questions specifically for your district, I think that's a good outlet to go for. Yeah. And honestly, and when I said like, the takeaways is just to relax and that liability is exaggerated, like we actually take that very seriously. We just have not seen that many cases where there's been a direct connection between a Safe Routes to School program and a liability issue. Like I said, I'm sure that they're out there, but I think that our main message is to kind of like keep the conversation on how do you make it safe for kids to walk, bike, and roll to school, and kind of, not keeping things totally the status quo, which, in a lot of cases isn't safe anyways. Like we're often trying to improve an unsafe situation. So by not doing anything, the safety risks will still, be there. But, now they're like no bike lanes or, whatever intervention could be there and actually make it safer.
So yeah, if you all have any, questions that are a bit more nitty gritty or specific examples, we're always around to answer questions. But in general, I'd say this question comes up a lot, but seeing like liability lawsuits in practice, we just haven't really seen that at a national level. It's a lot of like talk and chatter and concern, but nothing that's really amounted to anything super substantial. If that changes, I hope it doesn't, but if it does change, we definitely let you all know.
All right, thank you so much again for joining us. Really appreciate you making time for this and
Yeah,
being here.
thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect. I'm gonna switch screens here. Perfect. All right. And now we're gonna move on to Jessie Wilson with the LaGrande Parks and Rec to talk about first aid. And as part of the liability thing here, I just wanted to quickly clarify that the purpose of talking about this first aid is just to make you aware of some situations, talk about some potential ways to address any type of injury you might see there, but this is not first aid training. So Jessie will recommend some first aid kits and first aid training, but it is not meant to replace any type of first aid work that you might be doing. So with that, Jessie, I'm going to pass it off to you.
I also want to say that I've been trained in first aid for over 20 years. That does not mean I know everything, and some things I've discovered by accident. So, so common injuries. So today we're going to talk about common injuries, how to assess the severity of an injury, examples of protocols to deal with injuries, and first aid kit recommendations. I want to say in the first aid kit recommendations really quick, you'll notice it goes overboard when I do it, but I do that for, my own sanity. Okay, next slide. Common injuries we encounter most often are scraped knees and elbows. We always clean the scraped knees and elbows free of dirt with a clean rag. I don't ever use alcohol wipes or hydrogen peroxide on a wound for two reasons. One, it burns, and kids do not react well to that. And two, if you clean it too thoroughly, you're going to get rid of the natural bacteria that grows there and actually impede the healing process. And then I always put a bandage on everything. I realize it's probably excessive, but a Band-Aid makes the kid feel better or the student feel better. So a Band-Aid it is. And if a Band-Aid helps move, everything along, we go with it. So there are different levels of scraped knees and elbows. When we go into the protocol, you'll notice I say always use rubber gloves. No matter if there's any blood at all, always use rubber gloves. Bloodborne pathogens are real. And even if you don't get blood on the gloves, have them on hand, no matter what. All right, next slide, please. Pinched fingers. I have not ran a camp yet where I have not had a pinched finger, whether it be because they ran their own finger over or pinched it in chains or pinched it, I don't know. They just pinched their fingers. If there's blood, we do the Band-Aid, we clean it up and do the Band-Aid or put a Band-Aid on it. If sometimes you're going to see a really gross fingernail afterward, we just do our best to clean it up and then put a Band-Aid on it. And then ice packs. Ice packs will always be your friend. And if you don't have an ice pack, a nice cool cloth or paper towel, those things work magic. Right, next slide. Bee stings. The bee stings have been a plague for us this year. So this is where you need to be very aware of your students' allergies. In most scenarios, students will just swell. There are kids who don't know they're allergic to bees. And I'm trying to think of how to, if they don't know they're allergic to bees, you should always watch them after they get stung. If they don't know they're allergic to bees, then, and they start showing signs of like not being able to breathe, any kind of anaphylactic shock, immediately call 911. I don't mess with anaphylactic shock. I don't care if it's even a slight reaction. I always call 911. So I've had parents say, please call me first before you call 911. But if their child is not breathing, I am calling 911. A trick I found is using an alcohol swab to clean the sting area. The alcohol takes the venom out of their skin. It immediately wipes it away. It's not an open wound, so it shouldn't have any effect on anything. But the alcohol pulls out venom from hornets, wasps, and honeybees. And it will also prevent excessive swelling. Ice packs are super handy because bee stings are hot and it helps cool it down fast. But I always give the caregiver a call, and it's protocol for us to always call the caregiver if they get stung, so that way there's no surprises when they come to get them, or if they show secondary allergic reactions. Less common injuries. This is where I need to pull up my. So the first one are concussions. Concussions are tricky. For me, all head injuries should be treated like a concussion until you can assess that it may or may not be. I always err on the side of caution because concussion can be present with no signs. If a head injury is mild, and what I see by mild is like a little bump, and the child is acting absolutely fine, I will let the parent decide if they want the child to go home. So I always call the parent after a head injury. In my experience, 9 times out of 10, the parents are like, they're fine. If a head injury is a little more severe, like if there's a bigger goose egg, I always assess the child, call the parents, and if I don't see any issues, then usually we'll keep them, or we will, sorry, my cat just stepped on something, or we will have the caregiver come get them. Yep. Sorry, my cat's not helping me out here. Sorry about that. If a concussion is severe, and the student immediately starts showing signs, I always dial 911 and call the caregiver. Concussions can lead to some seriously bad side effects. So we always call 911 and then call the caregiver. Broken bones, there is no call the caregiver. We always call 911 and then call the caregiver. The most important thing to remember if a limb is broken is do not move the limb. I am not trained enough in mobilizing a limb to guarantee that there won't be some kind of secondary issue, like veins can be ruptured, bones can shift. I've seen some ugly things with broken bones, and so I know personally that I am not trained enough to stabilize a broken limb. So you do everything you possibly can to not move that limb, and then you call 911 and call the caregiver. And even I have again had caregivers contact me and say, can you call me before you call 911? And I have told them I cannot guarantee that. If a bone is broken, I will call 911 first. Their child safety is more important to me. Do you want to go to the next slide for the heat stroke? Oh, there we go. Sorry, we'll have to go back one. Okay, so heat stroke to me is, we don't play with heat stroke. I've seen heat stroke present as a stroke before because it's been so severe. Heat exhaustion. And I wanted this slide just so you can see that there's 2 different things. There's heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Heat exhaustion is dizziness, thirsty, heavy sweating, nausea, weakness. Those are all things that can be alleviated by getting the child or the student or the adult in cooler, like in shade, and giving them small sips of water. Heat stroke, always call 911. It will most likely, in the cases I've seen, everybody turns super red. They get really cold. They're dizzy. They aren't sure what's going on. But heat stroke is serious and people can die from it. So we always call 911 and let the EMTs come and do their magic. You can go back one, please. Okay, so how to assess severity. if the student is in severe pain, we always call the parent to see if they want the student to come home or wait. Most parents know their kids best. This last week, I had a child say they were really hurt, and I called the parent and said, okay, here's what's going on. Here are the symptoms. Here's the situation. What do you want me to do? And the parent told me that the child did not want to be at camp. So they said they were acting this morning like, they were telling them the same things. So I told the parent that I would watch the child, and if it continued, then I would call them back and they would have to come get them. So the parents know their kids the best. Visual inspection is the first chance you get to see how hurt the child is on the outside. Movement and recovery time is the second. So if you visually see a problem, it doesn't always mean that the child won't bounce back. So do everything on the outside you need to do, and then continue to monitor the child. Head injuries are always serious. I just went through this, but sometimes students will just get a bump, or even a bump can be a concussion. Always call the parents. Okay, next slide, please. Protocol examples. Let me get a drink of water. All injuries must be documented in an incident report. And I don't know what every program does, but even a simple incident report is super handy. Talking about liability, for me and for my program, because we're under Parks and Rec, we document incidents reports so that way somebody knows what happened, and that way we have something to go back on with our lawyers and stuff. So it is, by our standards, we have to have an incident report, even if it's a non-emergency. Any injury involving blood must be handled while wearing gloves. All materials that have been in contact with the blood must be double bagged and thrown in a designated garbage can. Our designated garbage can is in our office, so we don't always have access to that. So we triple bag it, and then we put it in the bottom of our backpack, and then we throw it away when we do a shift change. And I don't know if that's protocol, but that's what we've been doing forever. So that's our protocol. All head injuries are reported to parents immediately. All life-threatening injuries must be referred to emergency services. I also have to call my supervisor along with the parents for life-threatening injuries. Parents should be informed of any injuries at pickup, no matter if it's non-emergency or not. There's nothing worse than being a parent and finding out from your child that something happened instead of the adults who are in charge. So even if they fell down and scraped their knee, tell the parents at the end of the day. Okay, next, please. So here's my standard first aid kit that I keep in my backpack that I take with me. We have our work backpack, which has a bot first aid kit, but this is what I recommend. And so Band-Aids and gauze pads. Gauze pads help clean stuff up. Alcohol wipes for bee stings and also to help clean stuff up. Rubber gloves just to contain any kind of bloodborne pathogen. Tweezers are extraordinarily handy for removing splinters and for stingers. Ice packs, a small notepad and pencil. I don't always have paper with me, but in my emergency kit I do, because if I need to jot something down, like symptoms or anything that I feel is important, then I'll have that in my emergency kit to write it down. Students' emergency information. So I just put on a scooter camp 3 weeks ago, and when kids register, they have to put all their emergency information in. I have a printout of every student's emergency information in my backpack. Sunscreen, because it's really hot. And at least 1 or 2 bottles of water. And then I also, because when kids start looking like they're wilting, sometimes their blood sugar is dropping. So I will give them like a glucose tablet, which is just a giant Smartie. And while I'm basically giving them permission to go crazy, it makes them go, it helps perk them back up. So that way we can move on. All right. So these are just some stories that I have and some things that I have been through. Concussions to me are super serious. So, and in my experience, I'll just read it and you can go from there. A young boy I was teaching was playing in the playground and he tripped over a sandbox and he hit his head really hard. He immediately started having a large bump on his head. And so we had him sit down or sit up, but he was able. I do not pull a child up. I always have them sit up on their own. If there's something that hurts, then we don't move them, period. He sat up and it was clear, he was clearly in pain from his hitting his head and he was scared. When I was softly talking to him, because I had to be calm, even though I really wanted to freak out. I was looking at his eyes and noticed his pupils were different sizes. And to me, that is an immediate sign of a concussion. It's not immediately life-threatening, but it is an immediate sign of concussion. I had my coworker call his mom to come pick him up because there was no way we were going to keep him. And the mom had stated if it wasn't life-threatening that she would come get him. She did end up taking him to the doctor and he did have a mild concussion. So those were so we followed the protocols about calling his parents if it wasn't life-threatening. And then luckily she followed through. The most scary injury for me are falls. It's important not to run over and pick up the students. They could have a spinal injury or a neck injury that we can make it worse and actually paralyze a child by picking them up. It's really important for them to get up on their own. They won't get up if it hurts. That's why it's important to get up on their own. Then they need to calm down. So I always make sure I'm calm and help them breathe through it. And then we assess everything. If I'm excited and I panic, then everything gets worse. So through all of that, I had to keep my calm and not panic. No one can think clearly if panic sets in. I also have to remember to glove up. The mom in me wants to charge in and I want to just deal with it with no gloves. I want to just go in with gauze pads and just, do the emergency thing. But the caregiver in me needs to remember that I have to take care of myself first or I can't help anyone else. All right.
So any questions on first aid? And thank you for that anecdote as well, Jessie. It's good to hear examples of how these protocols have gone into practice in the field.
I just want to say that was awesome. I never knew that a simple alcohol wipe could take out the venom because I'm particularly susceptible to yellow jacket and bee stings. So that was fabulous to know, and for kids as well. I mean, that's so important. So simple, but so effective. Wonderful. The thing that we talk about with our public transit drivers regarding heat stroke is that the big change. I mean, they deal with riders who are getting on and off of buses, so they only have sometimes a real brief moment to assess whether somebody is experiencing heat stroke. And the biggest thing to look out for is that change in mental status. And so that's something easy, I think, to really focus on if you're trying to figure out how serious their reaction to heat is. And especially because if you are working with your kids, you would be able to you know them, so a change in mental status would be pretty obvious.
The one thing that I tell anybody I work with is prevention is better than treating it. So we have water breaks every half hour, and then we only spend about an hour in the sun. And that's if it's like under, right now it's like 100, it's supposed to be 103 today. So I told him before I left, I said, you can spend an hour in the sun if it's under 90. I said, otherwise, I said, you need to be in the shade. So prevention is better than treating it.
Yeah, I am kind of interested to, I just don't have a lot of experience with this, but where do you find that fine line between heat exhaustion and heat stroke? Because heat exhaustion can develop into heat stroke. So if you're worried a kid is on the edge, what would you do in that situation?
I have had experience, but not with a child, but with an adult who was almost a heat stroke. So what we did is we got them in the shade. We had them take small steps of not cold water, because cold water can actually cramp their stomach. So like warmer water. And then even though they were starting to get to the chills point. So they didn't like it because it hurts, but I put cold paper towels all over their head, because your head is where your heat goes out and comes in. So you need to put the cool paper towels on their neck and their head, and then take their shoes off to let the heat out of their body.
And that was able to prevent from going to full on heat stroke and just.
Yeah, we got it to come down enough. I still recommended they go to the doctor, because they still were kind of woozy and nauseous. And I told them, I said, you can go on your own. You're an adult. I can't make choices for you, but I highly recommend you go to the doctor.
Awesome. Any other questions here in the chat or from the group? Okay. We have about 13 minutes left. So I plan these scenarios as well too. If you would be interested in participating in them, I'll put you in a breakout room. So basically we have 3 scenarios. With your group, you'll go through what the scenario is, run through the injury, and kind of make up a plan for how you would address that. What would your protocol look like there? I'll do about 10 minutes there, and then we'll come back and see if anyone wants to share out. Perfect. Let me get those together. So scenario number 1, you're hosting a park and walk for winter walk and roll. On the walk to school, a student slips and bumps his head on the ice. In this situation, what are you going to do to ensure that student is safe? It's summertime and you've planned a bike rodeo at one of your program schools. During the bike rodeo, you notice that a student isn't drinking enough water and is showing some signs of heat exhaustion. So what are you going to do? In scenario number 3, you're walking with students on a regular walking school bus route. One student trips and scrapes their knee. It doesn't appear like anything is broken or displaced, but they're uncomfortable. So what are we going to do in this situation? I'm going to go ahead and create those breakout rooms real quick. And we'll assign some folks. Great. I'm going to go ahead and open those rooms. So I'll see you all back here in about 7 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining in on the activity. I realized unintentionally, I definitely made a Portland group and a East of the Cascades group. So it's kind of funny. Does anyone want to share out anything they talked about? Any takeaways? If not, that is fine too, but thought I'd open that up to everyone.
I think we got off topic, but Kathy and I talked about maybe also doing a incident report form for everybody.
Oh yeah, as a resource, that would be great. Yeah, if
and
you
maybe like even a basic first aid kit and what to have in your like emergency backpack.
Yeah, I was just thinking this too. It'd be great to get some resources on different local first aid trainings too that people could attend. Yeah, and Jessie, if you have a template of an incident report, I would love to take a look at that, and we could, yeah.
I do. I'll scan it and send it to you.
Perfect. Yes. Yeah, we'll send that out to you as well too, Patty.
And just something else, like at the end that came to mind, for funding or people purchasing first aid kits to have, would that be something through one of the micro grants or a grant that could cover that for people to have?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will chat with Heidi about that. Unfortunately, I think she had to jump off the call, but I think definitely within the micro grants, that is a budget expense that you could put in there. I'm not sure about general Safe Routes funding, but yeah, I mean, that's something that should be available, and is definitely a program.
Heidi did okay, and I don't know if it's, I know that it's, every grant is different, or, you know, it's. Anyway, Heidi did okay for us to buy first aid kits to put in our walking school bus backpacks.
Okay.
I don't know if that helps or not.
No, that is it's good to know that there's precedent for it. So perfect. Yeah, I think that is a great, every time we do these webinars, I feel like there's a new resource we can develop. So getting some kind of first aid kit recommendation, first aid training recommendations, and an incident report is a great idea. Awesome. Well, thank you all again for joining us today. Just some quick resources and announcements coming up. Incentive ordering is open. In the follow-up email here, I'll be sending out that link. If you are planning on ordering incentives for International Walk and Roll to School Day, which is October 4th, be sure to get those orders in by September 27th so that you have them on time. Our next webinar is going to be September 19th on high school engagement. We have two amazing people from the Bay Area who have been running some very successful high school programs. Both are very different programs, which will be nice to get an idea of what the options are for engaging high school students in safe routes. So that'll be September 19th, 11 to noon, and I'll have that registration coming out very soon. We moved our art contest to the fall this year. So if you want to promote this at your schools, let everyone know they can submit artwork up until the 31st of October to win a cool prize. And then finally, too, we have some equity trainings coming up. We'll be talking about disability justice and some other topics that you all have been asking for. These are going to be some longer trainings coming up this fall and next spring. So keep an eye on your emails from your hub coordinators and more information will be coming out about that. And so with that, thank you all so much again. We're right at noon, so appreciate you being here. Have a great day.